Hello, welcome back to ChigNotes for episode 9, our final episode. So for the synopsis element, as per usual starting point here, so these were the final chapters of the book. So we continued to learn about Ned's journey in the Marines and about the other battles that he had fought. Most notably now are the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. We learn about the different tactics and styles that the Americans used in war, but also we learned about what the Japanese had been doing as well, which was really interesting. Ned shows us that many Japanese soldiers were not super supportive of the war, nor were many civilians, and we get an interesting bit of information regarding the Japanese military structure and imperial power structure, and how their culture affected their methods of war too. This was an interesting contrast to learning about how the Navajo culture affected their style of war too. So that was really cool to learn about in these chapters. As we know, the Americans were able to end the war with some really harsh methods of bombing Japanese cities, which killed thousands. And then noted that he wished that this would have never happened, that it would never happen again, rather, I guess. So it was good to see that perspective. The story ultimately finished by Ned explaining to the grandchildren of his the importance of language and culture, and how Ned worked hard to maintain these elements for his grandchildren and others to enjoy. It was a great book, and we talk more about it in its entirety this time in the discussion questions, which are up next. We can start with discussion question 1. So for this first discussion question, which was, Ned mentions that many Navajo Marines did not like being called Chief as their nickname by non-Indigenous Marines, and some spoke up about it. This book and this scene demonstrate not only the value of a spoken language, but the words we choose to use while speaking that language. So the questions are, what are some other Indigenous related terms that have often been used that you've come to realize are inappropriate? And in what ways are societies shifting towards using a more politically correct vocabulary, and how do you see people responding to this shift so far? So pretty interesting question to start off with. And so for this discussion, we really started off by noting some of these terms that are Indigenous related that we no longer use, or that many of us no longer use due to their derogatory linkages. So some of these things were things like the Indian summer was one that came up. Calling things your spirit animal was another one. Things like, having a powwow or finding your tribe were things that we all noted that are not appropriate to use as non-Indigenous people. So just interesting to throw some terms around like that and sort of talk about the roots of those words and why they're inappropriate to use and stuff. So that was definitely interesting. And we did know, some of the members did note that, growing up, they also knew First Nations people that everyone called Chief, which was interesting to contrast here. When they were mentioning, when they were younger, they were thinking that this was like a fun nickname that was endearing, and not realizing the reality of what it meant. And we kind of noted here that Chief, this chief example really shows us how much the average person doesn't know about Indigenous political systems or structures, unless they had really gone out of their way to get that information themselves. So not understanding really what a chief is and stuff. So it was just interesting to note that. We also agreed that times are most definitely changing, and that the more conservative people, not necessarily speaking in a political term, but just conservative as their values and stuff. Those kind of people in North America seem to be the most resistant to this kind of change. And we talked about the reason for this and how it's likely because, they stand the most to lose in their minds, since they're at the top of that sort of social pyramid at the moment. So, nobody likes to think about what they're saying or doing, and they don't like having to change to better fit other people's needs, in some cases, perhaps. We also noted that some TV shows are really changing, or that some old TV show episodes are being removed from some streaming, some online streaming platforms, because a lot, although at this time it may have been more relevant or appropriate to use that kind of stuff, that language and stuff, but now we're realizing that it's not. So we definitely see a lot more shows being either taken down or episodes being removed and things like that, which is definitely interesting too. in the end of this discussion, we all agreed that, it was great to have young people sort of leading these kind of discussions about political correctness and offering teaching moments to others, so that they can reflect on, why are they using some of these terms, or why are they using others as the butt of their jokes. And it's nice that so many young people are not afraid to have those uncomfortable conversations now, and don't really let other people get away with using inappropriate or harmful languages, and sort of terms and stuff anymore. So, and this has, we've noted that it's definitely like trickled out from that generation, and making sort of all generations to some degree have some of those uncomfortable conversations as well. They don't have to be uncomfortable, but they just, it is a little bit difficult to approach that sometimes. And not a lot of people want to do that. So we just thought it was interesting that some people are definitely being inspired by people that are doing that work for others and for themselves. So we're just all feeling really inspired by some people that we know, and some younger generations. So that's kind of where we finished that conversation, and we can move on into the next discussion question. So this second question was, what role do you think World War II / Code Talkers, as in the people, played in the survival rate of the Navajo language, which it has roughly 170,000 speakers today, and is by far and wide the most commonly spoken Indigenous language in the United States. So that was a really interesting sort of fact, and pretty much right away for this question, we all felt as though the war and the Code Talkers definitely had some positive effects on the survival rate of the Navajo language. We felt as though, using this language in such a meaningful way, not only to the Navajo people, but in a way that helped all Americans and allies of America in the war, would definitely give the speakers so much pride and determination to maintain the language through generations afterwards. And we kind of also talked about how it was so specifically the language that was part of that culture that really helped with the war. And, maybe some other traditions faded out or died out a little bit, like it wasn't the, corn pollen sprinkling that was what was really helping that war effort. It was really the language. So maybe that was why this language has been able to survive so long, which is really great to see. It was also definitely really respected internally, as far as within the military after the war, and in the public once the information was released in, I think it said 1969. So the story became, super popular and was really respected, and we suspected that that would help Indigenous youth want to maintain that proud language as well. We also speculated how its use in war would have changed the protocols within boarding schools at that time, possibly, as in maybe they stopped being so intent on making young Navajo children forget the language entirely, since they suspected they might, and ultimately they did actually need it again for future wars as well. So maybe they sort of changed some of those tactics, though we didn't know, but just something we thought might have happened too, which would have been helpful for the survival rate. So we sort of we wondered what happened with the goals of these schools and how maybe that was affected. We also noted that having, 400 fluent code talkers throughout World War II really creates an extremely strong base of people who, have returned from war and had children and taught them Navajo too. So even just having a base of 400 speakers alone would be really significantly larger than some other language populations, which have dwindled over the years, unfortunately. So just having 400 really proud speakers kind of continue on with that language, I think would be really good. But obviously it's translated into over 100,000 speakers, so which is really great. And then we also, noted that it was a good way to ensure that this population would not buy into the awful idea that their language was useless and had to be forgotten, like they had been told in school. So just kind of having their language be so important would have maybe changed some potential minds that maybe started to think they were right, and maybe that the language wasn't so important and they should just switch to speaking English only. So we noted that using it in the war in such a meaningful way would have potentially reversed some of those ideas that had been really sort of brainwashed into some of these young people's minds. So that was definitely impactful as well. And then finally, we also know that some men were able to use the post-war veteran benefits like Ned did. Though Ned was a fictional character, We assumed some of the men might have followed this path that Ned described. He went off to college and focused on educational reform on reserves, and we did learn through a bit of research, one of the members did, that there was a big push for educational reform after, and that was part of the language sort of survival, so that was really neat to learn too. But yeah, so hoping that, potentially some real code talkers, not just Ned, actually did use some of these resources that were available due to being veterans to, help keep that culture and that language alive as well. So yeah, the discussion was pretty interesting considering some of the positives of war, considering when we think about war, it's always quite negative, and definitely, we're happy that we had people join and sort of keep our countries peaceful and safe on our soil. But yeah, it was interesting to just talk about maybe some of these positives that came out that weren't just strictly based on the typical positives that come out of that. So yeah, we can move on to the last discussion question. So this last question was, this book is written in such a way that the main character, Ned, is telling his story to his grandchildren. How do you think Ned's grandchildren would feel about their grandfather after hearing about his experiences? And what do you think are the most important lessons that Ned's grandchildren would take away from this story? What were some of the pros and cons to this writing style as well here? So here I just kind of got a feel from everyone about how they felt about the story, the writing style, and what lessons came out of the book. So we all felt as though Ned's grandchildren would have so much respect for him, after hearing this story, and it would make them really proud of their culture and their family as well. We also felt it would help his grandchildren understand how hard others had to battle for them to have this sacred language still, and still have that culture that they have. So sort of beyond these lessons of the value of language and culture, we also felt that Ned showed them the importance of respecting others while they speak and to listen actively, which is a really important lesson. Not to take what we have for granted as well, to respect the balance in nature and within ourselves as well, and definitely some other teachings, and we noted that with Indigenous storytelling, a lot of the time it's about deciding on the lessons for yourself and taking what you need from it. So that was kind of something we noted as well, that there wasn't definitely one big huge message beyond just the language being important. We kind of noted that there's a lot of subtleties throughout the book that you could either have resonate with you or not, so you get what you want from it. And we all really liked that the author chose not to vilify the Japanese nor the Americans more than one another to some degree, and he gave a very relatable element to everyone involved in the war in the story here, so we could empathize with everyone. We all felt like, we could empathize with the Japanese, we could empathize with other American soldiers, so that was a really great element to the story. We all really appreciated that the story was told from the Navajo and Americans' perspective, but Ned really managed to portray the different motivations of war on either side and how culture actually impacted both approaches to the war effort. We got to learn a lot about Japanese culture and their beliefs and how that affected how they went about participating in this war, so that was interesting too. We felt as though we really enjoyed the clarity and the sort of linear elements to this book and this storytelling style of book. It made it really easy to read. We all learned a lot about the war and Indigenous peoples as well in this way, and it also, we had some group members say that reading this book, which was written in this style, was actually quite nostalgic for them, since they had family members and grandparents that were really good storytellers, and that was really an important part of their childhood, so it's kind of reminded them of those days. Along that note, we also talked about the importance of people being able to tell these kinds of stories like Ned's, and how that can really help families understand one another, and also helps, heal a lot. A lot of men, we noted, don't feel comfortable due to societal norms and pressures, unfortunately, to talk about their traumas and their feelings and to just be vulnerable. So a lot of veterans became quite mean or alcoholics or both, and that can cause, generations of trauma and issues in families. And so some children will never really, unfortunately, get to understand why, because they're not able to have these kind of storytelling moments like Ned's grandchildren did. So we just discussed, how important it is to seek out mental health counseling in this moment, and create those spaces for men to deal with their traumas as well, so that it can stop those sort of cycles of violence and abuse, which unfortunately do tend to continue whenever people aren't able to deal with their traumas themselves. They kind of spill out into other people's lives, unfortunately. So just talked about that importance of dealing with mental health issues. And yeah, so ultimately we all really enjoyed this book. We learned a lot from both the author and from each other, just discussing it in these book club meetings. And as mentioned, this is the last and final episode for ChigNotes, the series. So I hope you enjoyed them and that you continue to seek out Indigenous literature and education, and just sort of enjoy that culture and all those different cultures. So thank you, Amigwech, for joining ChigNotes. And yeah, keep enjoying Indigenous literature.